with the title.
Sure. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be at Black Elves today. So my name is Christophe Tafani de Repère, and in this talk we'll be looking at how servers with weak SSH credentials are being exploited in the wild to create DDoS botnets. So a few words about me. So as I said, my name is Christophe Tafani de Repère. I'm a master student at EPFL, and I'm interested into everything related to application security, penetration testing, and also DevOps. So currently I'm working in Elka, which is a company in Lausanne that does software engineering, system integration, and also has some cybersecurity services. And in the past I've worked in a money transfer company named TransferWise based in London, and I've done some projects with the junior enterprise of my school. Yeah. So this talk has three main parts. In the first one, we are going to look at what kind of threats are targeting SSH servers. Then we'll take one sample of a malware that uses this to create DDoS botnets. And so we'll reverse engineering and see how it works. And I will try to do it in an interactive way, so you won't see some walls of assembly code. And in the end, we look at some practices and countermeasures that we can do to protect against this kind of infection. So at first, I didn't plan to do a talk on this because I was doing it just for me. So I woke up one day and I was wondering what would happen if I just left the server completely insecured on the internet. And this was an honest question because I didn't know if people were going to send spam, if they were going to mine some Bitcoin, Dogecoin, or the latest trending cryptocurrency. And so I set up a honeypot. So it's just a Linux box in a random cloud on which I put a SSH honeypot. So essentially it's SSH server on which anybody can connect with any credentials. And when somebody connects to it, it gets a shell that looks like a real one. So it looks like this, and it looks like a real shell, but actually it's just commands that are sandboxed, so it's not really real command. And it looks a bit like this. So on the standard SSH port 22, you have the honeypot that is listening for connections and accepting any connections with any password. And on a non-standard port, you have the real SSH server that you can use to administrate your honeypot. So I showed this. So I went to grab a cup of coffee, and I thought I would have to wait for a few days before seeing anything in the logs. And actually, a few minutes later, I got this. So in a few minutes, on a box that I just spawned, there was already few people that were connecting to this box. So I let the test run for another 72 hours, and what I got was this. So approximately 2,000 connections attempts from 190 unique IP addresses, and from 45 countries. So now I will show just a few statistics of what I found. So the attack patterns were mainly some bots that were trying to brute force some common credentials. And the general pattern was once a bot was connected to the server, it would just download a binary and then execute it. So here I have a few instances of this. So essentially it's the same. It just downloads something via HTTP or FTP, TFTP, and then it executes it. So these are just a few stats. We'll look at them quickly, which shows the first password that was tried first by the attackers. So it only shows the first password because since any password was considered as valid, I didn't get the chance to look at all of them. So the most interesting thing I think is a few passwords that we can see are targeted probably for embedded devices. Like we have a Cisco, we have a Realtek, OpenELEC, Dreambox. And this is a pattern that is also coming back for usernames. So this is the most popular username that were tried by an attacker. And as we can see, the root user is interestingly not the first. It's actually second, and the admin username is the default username for some pfSense firewalls and the OpenWRT distribution, which is for embedded devices. This is just some stats about the attacking countries. So mainly coming from IPs that were appearing to come from Russia and China. I wrote a small script if you ever want to geolocate some batch IP addresses. Just a small note, I will link to the slides at the end, so you will be able to download them if you want. About the malware families that were dropped on these honeypots, so there were mainly three. The first one is the XRDDoS malware family, which is malware that brute forces, that is dropped after having, that is using Linux machines to create DDoS botnets. And another one is the Tsunami, the Mayday malware family, which is similar in its features. And finally, another one was the Tsunami, which was basically a backdoor for Linux systems. And there was also some other attacks which were coming from either broken links or things like that. So an attacker would connect and try to download something that didn't exist anymore. So just a quick recap about the general architecture of a DDoS botnet. So the idea is that at the top you have an attacker, and the attacker doesn't want to talk directly with some exploited machines, and he wants a layer of anonymity basically between himself and the exploited machines. So the way it generally works, it can vary, of course. There is a layer of command and control servers, which then communicate with the exploited machines. So for instance, when you have the attacker that wants to run a DDoS attack against mycorp.com, he would first say to the command and control servers that he wants to run a DDoS attack, and then they would communicate with the exploited machines that would then run the attack. So now we're going to take a look at one of these malware that was dropped, which is the XRDDoS malware family. We'll see why it is named like that. And it was the malware that was mainly active a few years ago, so in 2015, if I'm not mistaken. But I thought it would be interesting to analyze it because the techniques are quite relevant today. In the presentation about Loki yesterday, we saw some things that are totally applicable with what we're going to do. And also, it's quite simple to reverse engineer. There is no packing or things like that. So I will try to do it in an interactive way. So we'll first look at some of the tools that we have at our disposal to reverse engineer some malware, and then we'll apply them to a sample of this malware. So there are mainly two kinds of analysis tools that we have at our disposal. There are static analysis tools, which essentially allow us to look at inside the binary what is stored in it, to decompile it and see the code in it and things like that. And dynamic analysis tools that we can use to essentially run a binary and see how it behaves, what files it creates, and these kind of things. So some very basic static analysis tools that we can have is very simple Linux commands that can give us a grasp at some basic features of the malware. And then, of course, some decompilers like Binary Ninja or ADI Pro, which allow you to decompile machine code to assembly code. And there is also a IDI plugin, X-Rays Decompiler, which allows you to take some assembly, so x86 assembly, and show some pseudo-C code, which might be useful. But I will sometimes show some assembly and sometimes show pseudo-C code, because sometimes it's not more readable. And with dynamic analysis, it's a bit more tricky because obviously you don't want to just run a malware on your laptop. So things that we would like from an ideal solution is to be separated from our main OS, just so that all our files are not encrypted, for instance. Separated from the internet, we want to be able to control what the malware does. We don't want to be accused of DDoSing somebody. And we want to be able to reverse it easily to a clean state. So we want to infect it, analyze it, and then make it clean again. And so one solution that is very good for this is virtualization, like VMware or VirtualBox. So it looks like this. This is one solution that you could do. You can create a virtual network in VirtualBox in which you put a machine that you're going to infect and a machine that you are going to use as a control machine to see what the malware is doing, basically. And if we zoom in a bit, it looks like this. So you have an infected machine on which you run a malware and some debugging and monitoring tools. So for Windows, it could be some things like Process Monitor, and for Linux, it could be strace or GDB, for instance. And then you configure the control machine in order to work as a network gateway for this network. And so all the traffic that is coming out the malware will go through this control machine. And this allows you to first sniff the traffic and also respond to it if you want to simulate some things. So I wrote a guide a few months ago about how you can set up this kind of things very easily with open source and free tools. So if you want it, I put the link in the slides. So another tool that I found to be very useful is strace. It's not specific to malware analysis. It's also very useful, I think, for debugging. Essentially, it's a tool that allows you to spy on the system calls that the program is doing. So you can see the system calls that it does with the arguments, and then you can also see what was the response from the kernel. And finally, one thing that you lose if you use an environment that is isolated from the internet is that you're not going to be able to see what the malware sends and what file it's going to download and this kind of things. So a very useful thing is to use a network simulator, basically, like iNetSim, which allows you on the control machine to simulate some common services like HTTP, DNS, even FTP, IRC. And so, for instance, you could say you want to fake all the DNS queries so that the malwares connect to your control machine instead of failing. FireEyes FakeNet NG is also doing the same thing. I didn't get a chance to look at it, but I think it's worth taking a look. So now that we have a basic panel of tools, we are going to apply them to this malware. And yeah. So yeah, as I said, this is a malware that was active a few years ago. So 2015, it was responsible for some DDoS attacks, mainly to China and Asia targets. And so this is the way the malware is dropped on the server. So this is a bot that connects to the honeypot or to the server via SSH and that runs these commands. So it's very basic. It's just HTTP and it does a wget and a curl just in case one of them doesn't exist. And so what we can start by doing with this binary is by doing very basic things in order to get a grasp at what we think the malware might be doing. So first thing, for instance, is to use the Linux file commands, which gives us two interesting things, mainly one. So it's a 32-bit executable for Linux, and the debugging symbols are not stripped. So essentially, we're going to be able to look at the function names and the variable names of the malware, and it will be a bit easier for us to understand. Then, since we know that the debugging symbols are not stripped, we can use something like readelf to see what's inside the binary. And we can grep on everything that looks like a source file. And this gives us the source, the list of the source files that were used to compile the malware. And based on that, we can first think, okay, there is autorun.c, so probably it's going to do something to run at startup. Encrypt.c, so probably some kind of obfuscation or yeah, hide. So we can think there's going to be some rootkit features. It's going to try to hide something that it does. And yeah, and already we have a very basic feature set that we think the malware has, just with two very basic Linux commands. And then we can be a bit more involved and open it inside disassembler. So the first thing it does when it starts is it's going to decrypt some configuration that is stored encrypted in the binary. So these encrypted configuration values are here in orange, and you can see multiple calls to this decrypt configuration function, which is essentially just a call to another function named encrypt code. And what this function does is just basically a XOR. So we can see that for each byte, it's going to do a XOR operation byte by byte. And this XOR keys that we can see here is inside the binary hard-coded. So we can easily see that it's BB2FA something. And this is a key that is that changes sometimes. So there are certain versions of this malware that has different keys. Yeah. So the first thing that we can do in order to see the configuration, so one thing that we can do is to debug it and put some breakpoints, obviously. And another thing that we could do is to rewrite this algorithm in Python. So it's just a XOR byte by byte, nothing very interesting. And this is the key that we found in the binary. And then we can take in the binary the encrypted configuration values and decrypt it with this algorithm. So in this case, we get /user/bin and a null byte, which seems quite reasonable for a C string. And so if we do this with all the configuration values that are stored in the binary, we get this. So we can see it's mainly some paths configuration. And we also have a few URLs that looks more interesting. And this one, so aaa/config.rar is a configuration file that the malware is going to download when it starts up. And it contains some configurations such as the URL of its command and control server and stuff like that. So unfortunately, it's not accessible anymore. I did not manage to find it, but some other analysis have showed that it contains things like the URL of the command and control servers and stuff like that. And this is a domain which is hosted in China, apparently. You even have the registrant address if you want to send him a Christmas card or something. And the next thing the malware is going to do is to gather some information about the system. So it's going to run a bunch of Linux commands in order to see what user it is running as, what are the different files on the system, how many network interfaces it has, and these kind of things. And then it's going to encrypt it using what we saw earlier. We saw with just XOR encryption, and to send it to its control server. And we can see this quite easily in the assembly code. So we have a call to a function named getMemStat, and then get CPU info, get LAN speed, and then encrypt, and then save some to this server. So the next thing it does is it's going to essentially copy itself into several locations of the system. So things that look like a bit innocent, like /lib/libudev.so.6, which doesn't look like very malware. And then it's going to store itself inside a random looking binary. And then it's going to append a random string at the end of it. And I think here the goal is that since it's going to be different for every infection, you will get a different hash for every infection. And so if you're just looking for this malware with some basic MD5 or SHA-1, you're going to miss it. And this is the strace output. So we can see it opens this file, it goes to the end, then it seeds a random number generator, and then it writes random string at the end. And then it's going to essentially close and execute this new binary that is created. And then next thing it's going to do is it's going to create a system service in order to run a startup. And it does this using two things, depending on which OS is running. So for Debian-based system, it's going to use chkconfig, and for Red Hat and CentOS, I think it's going to use, the opposite. For Debian-based system like Ubuntu, is going to use update-rc.d and chkconfig for Red Hat. And so this is also the strace output, and this is the system file that it creates. So it's just fancy stuff for saying that it wants to start with the system. Then, because it's very paranoid, it's going to create a cron job using this command line. So it's just essentially creating the cron job that is going to run every 3 minutes, and which is going to run this script, etc cron.hourly/gcc.sh. And this script is this one, which essentially is first looking at all the network interfaces to make sure they are started up and running. And then it's just going to make sure that the malware is running just in case it was killed or something like that. And another very interesting thing about this malware is that it's going to use a feature of the Linux kernel named the loadable kernel module, which allows you to essentially insert in the kernel at runtime some code. With, for instance, the ensmod command. And it's going to use this to create a virtual device that is then going to use to execute some code in the kernel space to hide some of its activities. And it does that by actually overwriting some standard system calls like open or fstat. And it's going to look at if the system call is for a file that it doesn't want you to see. It's going to say, nope, I don't know it. And otherwise, it's just going to proxy it to the real system call. So we can see that there are, for instance, two functions, hide PID port and hide file. And the hide file procedure is going to open the rootkit device, and then it's going to communicate with it using this IOCTL system call, which is essentially going to tell him, okay, from now on, I don't want you to show this file when somebody tries to open it. And since this code, so since the rootkit code is running in kernel space, it can do whatever it wants, and so it's not going to. So this is going to hide a particular file. So then, if you do a cat or ls on it, you're going to see that it doesn't exist actually. And this only happens if the malware is running as root, because obviously you need to be root in order to do that. So this might seem like a quite advanced feature, but there are quite a lot of LKM rootkits that you can find on GitHub. I found a new one yesterday that was brand new. And so I think it's quite interesting, and there is a good reading resource from Sans on the topic, which I've linked here, so bit.ly/sans-lkm. Then we're going to look at how the malware is communicating with its command and control server. So basically, it's polling it, and it's waiting for tasks to do and instructions to execute. And it can do 5 main things. It can first download and execute an arbitrary file. It can also update itself, just in case there is a modification that the author wants to do without redoing a whole infection. It can also kill a running process, which is quite interesting because apparently it's doing this in order to kill some of its competitors. So it's going to look at, okay, what processes are running. Okay, this one, I don't like it. I think it's a competitor. So I'm going to kill it. So yeah, it's a malware on your system. And then it can also remove files. And the main feature of the malware is that it can also run a DDoS attack. So basically, there are 3 kinds of attacks that you can run. The first one is a TCP SYN flooding attack, TCP ACK flooding attack, and DNS amplification attack. And we can see that this is an operation code that it receives from the control server, and based on this, it's going to choose what kind of packets to send to the target. So just a quick recap. So as you might know, this is what a TCP handshake looks like. So you have a client that sends a SYN packet to the server. At this point, the server is going to allocate some resources to keep track of the connection state. And then it's going to send back a SYN ACK, and then the client is going to send some ACK along with some data. And the idea of TCP SYN flooding is that if you send a lot of SYN packets to the server at a very high rate, the server is going to have to allocate a lot of resources, and then at some point it will become overwhelmed and it will stop accepting requests from legitimate clients, which essentially is the result of a DDoS. And TCP ACK flooding is essentially similar, but with ACK packets. The idea is that when you send an ACK packet to a server, it first has to look at its TCP connection table to see if the ACK is for a valid connection, has the correct sequence number, and these kind of things. And so it's a bit less effective than SYN flooding, but it's more effective to bypass firewalls, IDS, and some DDoS prevention mechanisms. So it's the same, you send a bunch of ACK packets to the server, hoping that at some point it will become overwhelmed. And finally, DNS amplification is based on the fact that you can do some DNS queries that are much smaller than the answer that they produce. So for instance, here I did a DNS query against ietf.org, and we can see in Wireshark that the query is 95 bytes, and that the response is 3,000 bytes. And this means that if you do a DNS query and that you spoof the source IP of the query, the DNS server is going to answer to the spoofed IP, so to your victim. And it means that from a 1 gigabit per second upstream link, you can do 32 gigabits per second DDoS attack, basically, in theory. And this is quite small amplification factor. There are some other domains and things that you can do to have a 1 to 100 amplification factor. So this is the idea. So as I said, you have the attacker that sends a DNS query to a legitimate DNS server, like Google's, and it just spoofs the source IP address. So the DNS server is going to do its things, and then to answer to the source IP, which in this case is going to be the victim. And so it will look like, for the victim, it's being DDoSed by the Google DNS servers, basically. Just a quick point. These attacks are very simple to implement for an attacker using raw CSockets or hping-free or Scapy. But the challenging part for an attacker is to have them run from a lot of different countries, of different networks, and this kind of things. So we're coming to a few conclusions of like things and techniques that we can do to avoid this kind of infection. So first thing is that maybe it was true a few years ago that if you had an IP that you never shared with anybody, it was safe. But in 2017, it's probably not. We had a good talk yesterday on internet wide scanning, and there are also a lot of tools like Shodan and Census that are constantly scanning the IPv4 space, looking for vulnerabilities and things. So it's not because an IP address is not shared that it's secure, especially now that we have the cloud with IPv4 addresses that are being pulled and reused all the time. Also, it would be a good idea to use SSH, strong SSH passwords, or even better to use SSH private key authentication for two reasons. First, that you are not very likely to register to a website with a SSH private key that you're going to use on your server, which is not maybe the case with a password. And also, a private key is going to be stronger than any password that you could use, basically. Also, there are some very basic things that we can do to protect against some brute forcing. For instance, fail to ban is a tool that is going to look at the logs and to basically ban someone when he's going to try to do too many connection attempts. So for instance, here, this is a very simple configuration where it's going to allow only 3 failed login attempts in a window of 5 minutes. And after that, it's going to ban the attacker for 5 minutes, for 1 hour. And yeah, very simple thing. And also, but this is obvious, if we don't need root login on our machine, probably it's not useful to allow it. Another thing, so this is a snort rule for the malware that we just analyzed. So as we can see, it does 2 things. It's going to say, okay, if there is some HTTP communication with this URL, this is the endpoint that the malware is using to retrieve its actions from its CNC server. Then it is going to do 2 things. It's going to raise an alert. So somebody is going to have an email or a notification or something. And it's going to drop the packet. So using an IDS like Snort or Suricata or things like this is probably a good idea. And this is included in free community rule set. So even with some open source tools, you can basically block some basic and known attacks. And also with this kind of tools, it's some of them are rule-based. So if we use rule-based IDS or IPS, it's only as good as the rule it has. So we have to make sure that it has an up-to-date rule set. And there are some tools for this, such as pulled pork for Snort and Suricata. So I think we're coming to the end. So I've put a few resources. So first, you can download these slides from this URL if you want to maybe look at them. I also have the sample of the malware that we just analyzed. So if you want to play with it and reapply some of the things we saw to the real malware, you can download it. Just put a password on it, not to be banned from Google. And also I have put a few resources on malware analysis if you're interested. And thank you.
Thank you for your talk. We have time for questions. Are there any questions?
Hello, just a quick question regarding the command and control server. Could this one also be somehow infected? So I mean, could it be that the attacker doesn't have even this command and control server in his realm, but somehow it's infected and someone is not even aware that his machine or her machine is a command and control server?
Yeah, I think it's a very common thing, especially for anonymity. It's a very good idea because if you're going to say to the police, okay, there is a CC on this IP, and then it goes and you see that it's a legitimate website. Yeah, definitely. In this case, I'm not sure because I didn't get the real CC IP address, but yeah, it's a common thing. Yeah.
So that means there are maybe some rootkit also to infect the machine so that it becomes a CNC
Yeah.
server.
Yeah.
Exists also.
Are there other questions? No? Then let's take the speaker again.
Thank you.